Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Nun Daled. We're going to start, sort of goes a little off topic. Okay, we started yesterday, if you remember, and I told you we're going to continue this idea of an item changing its size, and then what do we go by, the original size or the size that it becomes. We'll get back to that very shortly. We seem to go off on a tangent. I'm not exactly clear why, but on two topics. So we're now on, I know why, because we're talking about the seor, right? That was how we got there in terms of the shiurim, how you measure the solet. So now we're going to talk about two issues that have to do with solet, okay? And with the leavening. The first one's going to deal with the leavening of these mincha offerings, and then we're going to get back to that topic that we mentioned previously. So Tanu Rabbanan, very bottom of Nun Gimel Amud Bet. Ein machmitzim b'tapuchim. You cannot make these mincha offerings with apple juice. Okay, juice from an apple or any kind of fruit juice. You have to use water, not a fruit juice. Mishum Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel amru machmitzim. Chanina ben Gamliel says you can, because they leaven, and that is considered leavening for the requirement of, again, we're talking about the shtei lechem and the lachmei todah, the two mincha offerings that need leavening. There's a machloket here. Is leavening by juices, right, by fruit juice, is that considered leavening or not? This, by the way, has important ramifications halachically for egg matzahs. Right, this big debate about egg matzahs. It's directly or at least somewhat related to this machlokah. We're not going to get into the whole question of egg matzahs and whether you can use them, but that's basically what they are, right? It's items that are needed, right? Matzah that's made with made tapuchim, or whether it's eggs or also there's some fruit juice sometimes in them. And are they considered leavened or not, right? That's why, are you allowed to eat them or not? But anyway, back to our specific topic. The question is, since you have a requirement in these mincha offerings to leaven them, is that called leavening? Okay? Or is it really only water leavens properly? Rav Kahana, Matnei Rabbi Chanina ben Tragium, this is a side point, that this Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, who said machmitzim, they do leaven and you can use them for the mincha. Well, Rav Kahana says actually it wasn't that Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, it was Rabbi Chanina ben Tragion. Kaman az lahaditnan. Now, according to who does the following Mishnah go? We're now going to say, it looks like this Mishnah only fits with one of the opinions. Okay, we're going to quote a Mishnah in Terumot, chapter 10. This is in the world of Terumot. We're going to get back to Terumot from a different topic today, but right now we're talking about teruma, that if you have teruma, let's say an apple that's teruma, and you take the juice from that apple, okay, you crush the apple, meaning turned it into juice, and you put it in a dough, and it leavened it. Now, there's a law, this is all in laws of nullification. We want to know now, is this dough teruma or not? So the question is, did it leaven it or not? Why? Because if something, we have all these rules that we've learned all throughout the years we've been learning together about dine bitul, right? When is something nullified in something else? So the isa is not truma, the dough is not truma, but the leavening agent is. Now, if the leavening agent and it leavens the bread, we're basically going to say, remember, there's 1 in 60 and all these things, right? Or truma is not batel, truma to be batel is 1 in 200. So it's harder to, I think it's 1 in 200, if not 1 in 100. Anyway, don't lose me for this very second. But point being that if the truma actually leavens it, that makes it so important, such an important part, even if you don't taste the apple juice. But because it created this process of leavening, which turned this bread into bread, this dough into bread, then no matter what, it's never batel. The phrase is, afilu be'elef lo batel, even in 1,000. It's not nullified. So basically, we're going to say that if this is considered a leavening agent, then it's going to be truma, and the whole thing is going to be forbidden to non-kohanim. And that's in fact what the Mishnah says. And it leavened the dough. Harezo asura. This whole thing is forbidden, obviously not to kohanim, but it's forbidden to non-kohanim because the leavening agent was truma. So now, kiman. Who does this go according to? Leima Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, hiva lo Rabbanan. Sounds like it's Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel who said, apple juice is a leavening agent, and because it's a leavening agent, you can use it in your mincha. And the rabbi said, you can't use it in your mincha. Presumably why? Because it doesn't really leaven properly. If it doesn't leaven properly, then we wouldn't say, it's not batel. That's at least what they think. But then the Gemara says, no, they suggest afilu tema rabbanan, tihi de chametz gamur lo have, nukshe miyahave. Okay, there's something called chametz nukshe, which has different definitions. Here it seems to be using it as a definition of something that is partially leavening. And then we're going to say like this. For the laws of teruma to say, oh, this teruma leavened this dough, and therefore it's not batel because it actually caused a process to happen, that's, we're going to say, even chametz nukshe, even chametz that somewhat leavened something, okay, or some people say chametz nukshe is from hard, like it leavened it in a way that it's hard, like it didn't really expand as much. Unclear exactly how to define it, but it's somewhere in between matzah and chametz, right? It's not really chametz. So for the laws of the mincha, where the Torah requires that it be chametz, it's not enough. It didn't leaven it enough. But it is enough to say that this teruma is never batel because, right, we're going to call this whole thing teruma because it did have an effect on the dough that was significant. Just maybe not significant enough to say for a mincha it's going to work. And then we basically distinguish between the cases and say you can't really connect these two. Okay, so what we had is a machloket about whether the liquid from fruit juice, okay, the liquid from fruit leavens or doesn't leaven. By the way, when it comes to, there's a whole question, is it mixed with water, not mixed with water? Are we talking about just the juice itself or juice mixed with water? That also has ramifications on the whole egg matzah debate. But anyway, I'm not going to, anyone who wants to research, you can look it up. Like look up an article about egg matzah and understand better how it works and how it connects. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next machlok. Also, this really seems a lot less connected to our sugya. But Amar Rabbi Ila, en lecha kasha lekmitza yoter minchat chotei. Okay, let's define a few things. First, mincha chotei is the sinner's mincha offering. If you remember, that's when the korban ola v'yoreh, the sliding scale offering we've learned about many times, which is somebody sins unwittingly, right, in certain things particularly, right? There's certain particular things that you bring a korban ola v'yoreh for. And if you don't have the money to afford the animal, you bring the birds. If you can't afford the birds, you bring a mincha offering. So that mincha comes, if you remember, it's very basic, no oil, no frankincense. It's as simple as possible because it's a sinner's one. We don't want to have a nice, beautiful mincha offering for a sinner, even though, remember, shelo yehei chotein niskar, on the other hand, we don't want to reward the guy, oh, you sinned, so you have to bring even less, spend less money. But in the end, we say you don't bring it with all those things. Now, because of that, Rabbi Ila says, imagine, you don't mix it with anything, it's just dry solet. Well, the kometz, right, this is the hardest kometz to do, because the kometz has to be an exact handful. Now, if it's falling apart, now what do? Remember, you stick your 3 fingers in, and then the 2 side fingers push off any extra clumps, but like things are going to fall out because it's grainy, right, granular, and it's going to start falling out, and it's going to be very hard to get the exact handful. Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi amar minchat chotei megabla b'mayim u'kshera. What are you talking about? You just mix water in and it's totally fine. Okay, the reason I assume they're talking about this here because we had the whole thing in the Mishnah about how, remember, megabla b'mayim. One second. Megabla b'mayim. No, that actually wasn't. I guess that wasn't here. Okay. Pushrim. Oh no, I guess that's coming up. Sorry. Yeah, that's the next one. Okay. I prepared it for Shabbat. On the next half, we're going to talk about how we put water in the dough. Okay, I'm just confused because I taught out of order. Okay, so anyway, so I'm not really sure why this is here, but he says you mix it in with water, and then you're not going to have a problem, right? That's fine. He says there's no problem putting water in. It says no oil, no lavona, but yeah, you add water, and then you don't really have such a problem. So now the Gemara suggests. Oh, right. Now I know. Now I remember why. Sorry, I'm a little confused this morning. Not getting enough sleep these days. Now I remember why they brought it here, because this has to do with the previous machloket about how we measure it. Okay, this goes back to the measuring. Threw me off as the sugya in between, which really seemed to have nothing to do with anything. But now we're back to the measuring of the... So now they say, Lema baha kamipalge. Let's suggest that this is the root of their machloket. Demar savar kimot shehem misharin, umar savar likimot shehem misharin. Okay, let's get the lingo proper, and we're going to see where they get this language from. Kimot shehem means as it is now, and likimot shehem means as it was then. Okay? Now, when you do the kometz, it has to be an exact handful. Exact handful of what? Of what the handful of solet would have been from the beginning, of what it required. So if it's solet and shemen, then it's solet and shemen. If it's just solet, then it's just solet. Now, if you have to go by the original, what it was then, and you now added water, when you do the handful, you're not going to get the exact amount. So Rabbi Ila says it goes by the original amount, and that's why you can't add water to it. Because once you add the water, remember we said adding water is either going to make it much more dense or it's going to make it expand more. And either which way, you're not going to be able to measure that handful properly because the handful has to be measured based on a handful of what it would have been before you added the water to it. But Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi says, no, it's kimot shehen, as it is now. So if you added water, it's fine. Okay? So because it doesn't matter, you measure it based on what it is now. What is now, it has water, so it's fine. It doesn't have to match up to the amount it was then. So they suggest, okay, pay attention. This was introduced with the word lema. Let's suggest that this is the root of their machlokah, what we were talking about in the previous sugya. So now they say, lo. Everybody thinks we go by the shear now. And theoretically, that's not the reason why you can't add water, okay? You can add water in terms of having your handful be the right amount, because it doesn't matter. That's fine. We go by, when you need a kometz of what it is in its current form and not based on what would have been a kometz had you not added anything. But what's the root of their machlokah then? Which we now really have to explain. Rabbi Ila, who says you can't add water. The root of their machlokah is this. Demar savar mai chareva mishemen. Umar savar chareva michol davar. The real debate is, what is chareva? Chareva, okay, where does chareva come up? So the Torah says in Vayikra Zayin Yud, V'chol mincha blula b'shemen v'chareva l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh ish kachiv. All the minchas end up going to Aaron and his sons, meaning the extra parts of them, whether it's blula b'shemen mixed with oil or whether it's chareva. So chareva means not mixed with oil, according to Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi. But according to Rabbi Ila, chareva is not just opposite mixed with oil, not mixed with oil, but chareva means dry. Dry means dry, no water in it. So he says dry literally, no water, no oil. So that's the root of the machlokah, which has nothing to do with our topic. Now we're going to get really into our topic, though, okay? And this starts again, it kind of started because we had a mention of it before. Now we got into, maybe that's the root of the machlokah, but rejected that. And now we're going to get deep into this topic of things changing form, okay? And we're going to keep going with this through to tomorrow's daf. So Tananatam, we quote a Mishnah. We're going to have a lot of Tanaitic sources today. We quote a Mishnah in, this Mishnah is in, Uktzin, right? This is the Mishnah in Uktzin. Uktzin is the last Masechet of Shas, and it's all about Teruma and Tara. It's a very short Masechet. Basar ha'egal shenitpach, ubasal zkena shenitba'ich. Okay, we have meat. Okay, let's get background. We're in the laws of Teruma and Tara. In order for something to pass on impurity, food, okay, let's say a food became a rishon, a person who was tameh touched food, right? A person who was an avatuma touched food, turned it into a rishon, that food touches other food, turns it into a sheni. In order for it to pass on impurity to something else, the food has to have a requisite amount of a kibetza, an egg bulk, not an olive bulk, which is usually food. In tuma, it has to be an egg bulk to be able to pass on tuma. And there's a machloket about whether for it to become tameh in the first place, it has to have a kibetza also. This kibetza is known as the shear for food in tuma. The question is it just to be able to pass on impurity, or even if the person touches the food, is he going to make it impure only if it has an egg bulk of an amount, or maybe even a kazayit? That's a machloket, but among the commentaries. But the basic idea here is let's just go with the one that everyone agrees with, but you could explain it in both according to some, right? But the point is, does this pass on impurity? Or maybe does it become impure in the first place? But so it's for laws of impurity, it needs a kibetza for some part of laws of impurity, if not all of them. So now we have basar egel that was a kibetza. That wasn't a kibetza, but then nitpach, but then it blew up and it became a kibetza. So does it now turn food into? Can it cause other foods to be impure? Or basar zkena sheditmayech, or it had a kibetza originally and then it got crushed, okay, and it's now smaller than a kibetza. So now mishta'arin lekimot shehen. The Mishnah says we go by what it was originally, okay, which sounds like, right, If it was a kibbetza in the beginning, then it will be mitame. If it wasn't, then it's not. But on this Mishnah, Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yochanan Amre, Mishtarin Kimot Shehen. Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yochanan all have a girsa that was different. It didn't say likimot shehen. It said kimot shehen, how they are now. And Shmuel, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Rish Lakish Amre, Mishta'arin likimot shehen. So we have a machloket about what the Mishnah said. Did it say one thing or the opposite? Okay, did it say we go by what it is now, or did it say we go by what it was? So that's a big debate, and that's why they were saying before, maybe that's what Rabbi Ilah and Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimi, each one had a different girsa. Okay, that was the suggestion of the Gemara. Do we go by what it was, or do we go by what it is now? Now we're going to go into this, and we're going to have two difficulties on the opinion that we go by the original. We're going to say it doesn't seem to make sense that we go by the original based on these two sources. Okay, we're going to bring one source. One source is clearly brought as a meitive, as a difficulty. The other source is introduced with tashma, which could mean it's brought as a difficulty, or it could mean it's brought as a proof for the other side. Either which way, it's saying the content is the same. About why they're bringing it, it seems to be going, again, both of these seem to go against the side that it's from, we go by the past. It seems much more so that we go by what it is now. So let's see the sources. So source number one. Basar ha'egel shelo hayabo kishiur. V'tafach v'amad al kishiur. So it sounds like the same kind of thing. It didn't have enough of a requisite amount originally, and then it expanded. Okay, sometimes water could get in it, which again, water isn't really part of it, right? But it makes it bigger, and now it is an egg bulk. Tahor l'sha'aval v'tamei mikanu lahaba. So anything it came in contact with earlier is pure. But anything it came in contact with from the moment it expanded to the shear of a kibetza, to that size, is going to be a problem. So that seems very clear that we go by what it is now. Okay, can't be more clear than that. To which the Gemara responds and says, no, midirabbanan. This halacha in this source is a rabbinic law. It's not a Torah law. By Torah law, we go by the original. The rabbis were strict. You can imagine why the rabbis would be strict here. Because you have food that became impure, and if we say that it doesn't have enough of a shear to pass on impurity, okay, and then we basically, everybody sees there's food that's the size of a kibetza, it's impure, it's not passing on impurity, but it's a kibetza. Now, who knows that it wasn't originally, right? What is the naked eye sees an object that's a kibetza and it's impure. I mean, again, you don't really see that it's impure, but let's say they knew it was impure. You can see why the rabbis would be stringent here, because in the end, right now, it's a kibetza, so let's be strict about it. But it doesn't mean that that's really the Torah law, the way the Torah views it, that, no, when it's something else, okay, when there's no reason to be strict, let's say, so we would just say, or I don't know, right now it's just saying it's a rabbinic law, and that seems to resolve the problem, because what we were talking about before, maybe it was Torah law. Okay, now, if you're going to say this is all rabbinic, that definitely doesn't match the continuation of this braita, because what does the braita say? Not only for laws of impurity are we going to go by what shear it is now, but v'chein b'pigul v'chein b'notar. Also by pigul and notar. Now, what do we assume they mean? We assume they mean that if you had meat, where the Kohen had a pigul thought, like, I'm going to eat this beyond this given time, or I'm going to burn it beyond the time, or whatever it might be. The meat is now pigul. If you eat a kazayit of it, you're going to get karet, or a notar, you left it beyond the designated time, and you eat it. If you eat a kazayit, you get karet. And now we're going to say, if you say v'chein b'pigul v'chein b'notar, we're talking about a piece of meat that wasn't a kazayit originally, became a kazayit because it expanded, it was, there was some water. You're going to get karet for that. If this is a durabanan, rabbinic, you're not going to get karet for that. And this is obviously a Torah law, pigul and notar. So, iyamar bishlamad oraita, if you're going to say this is a Torah law, that we go by what it is right now, and then that would contradict those who say we go by what it was originally, hainu deika pigul and notar. Then you can explain why pigul and notar are listed here. El iyamar durabanan, pigul v'notar b'durabanan mi'ika. There is no such thing as pigul and notar on a rabbinic level. You're not going to get karet by rabbinic law. We don't do that. So if it didn't have a kazayit to begin with, and now you eat it, right? You shouldn't get karet if we really view things based on what they were originally. So Ema, they say, oh no, you misunderstood the pigul and notar comment there. V'chein betuma pigul, v'chein betuma notar. No. What we're talking about here is the impurity of pigul and notar. Okay, we learned a lot about pigul and notar and tzvachim. What kind of impurity? They're not impure, right? There's always pigul, notar, v'tameh. Those are three distinct categories. No tameh, right? Pigul and notar aren't tameh. Well, you might not remember this because when we learned it way back in Psachim, we weren't really in the mindset of pigul and notar and all that. But Rashi brings up a very interesting point. It's interesting they didn't quote this in Tzvachim at all. Okay, we're learning all sorts of interesting things about pigul, like we have finally had that source about the Kohen paying, right? Now we say, again, this is in the same kind of vein. If you look in Rashi in the Tumat Pigul v'Notar, Dekam alam beperak ketzad solin in Psachim pehei, hapigul v'hanotar mitamim et hayadayim. The rabbis said that if you touch pigul and notar, your hands are now tamei. Okay, why did they do this? Okay, afilu lo nag'a behem tuma. Now, pigul and notar are not tamei. Okay, so even if you didn't touch tuma at all, but you touch pigul or notar meat, your hands are tamei. Why did they do this? Mishum chashde kehuna kedem mefarish hatam. The Gemara there says, we suspected Kohanim that they were going to intentionally do pigul to the korbanot or leave over the meat beyond the designated time, and they're the ones kind of responsible for it. So, and also mostly a lot of the notar was the Kohen, because much less of the meat was eaten by the people. Most of it was eaten by the Kohanim or the minchas. So, in order to avoid pigul and notar situations, they basically said to the Kohanim, oh, by the way, if you touch pigul and notar, your hands are going to be impure. Now, Kohanim don't want their hands impure because then they touch their teruma, they destroy it. That's their food, okay? Anything they touch, they're in the temple, they can't be impure. So if they tell you that pigul and notar meat is impure, it's going to make your hands, you're going to have impurity in your hands, people are going to avoid situations of pigul and notar because it's going to mess them up. They're going to have to go to the mikvah, go through a pool, right? They don't want to do that. So it was a penalty kind of thing that they instituted. So that is rabbinic, okay? And now we're going to say like this. If we assume that in that brayta they're talking about pigul and tumat pigul and tumat notar, then it goes like this. Sal kadat achamina. You might have thought, ho'il v'tumat pigul v'tumat notar durabananu, kulei hai v'durabanan lo avid rabanan kamash malan. Now they're going to say like this. Our whole law we explained to resolve this difficulty was rabbinic. That really we go by the original, but in this case, the original didn't have a shear, but the item had the shear. Right now it does. It expanded. We're going to be strict about it passing on impurity because it looks like a chametz, so we'd rather be strict about it. Now that's a Torah law, tumantara in general, right? The things are matame. So we're going to be strict on Torah law to say, well, even though this really doesn't have the right shear, we're going to make it have the right shear anyway. The Torah law is laws of tumah in general. And we're going to be strict on a rabbinic level and say, well, it didn't have a chametz originally, now it does, it's going to pass on impurity. But in tumat pigul and tumat notar, which the whole source for that impurity is all rabbinic, maybe you would have thought that we're not going to go by that now it's a chametz and be machmir. The rabbis didn't put their gezerah, right, into that case, their takana, into that case as well. Kamash malan that they did. The Bright is telling you, even for tumat pigul and tumat notar, if it wasn't a chametz originally, now it is, it's also going to pass on impurity. Okay? So that's basically the way we resolve that source by putting the whole thing in a rabbinic framework. That it's all rabbinic, it's not Torah law. So in other words, again, by Torah law, we go by the original. By rabbinic law, in the case of Tumah, we're going to go by the current state. Tashma, now we're going to bring another source, which is going to also start off seeming to indicate, again, you could read this, I said this in the beginning, you could view this as a difficulty on the source that says original, or it's as proof for the source that says we go by now. Basar zakena shayabo kishiul, v'tzamak pachot mikishiul, tameh l'shavar v'tahor mikanu lahaba. So again, you have old meat that had a shear originally, it shrunk, okay, because it was old, and now is less than a kibetza. Tameh l'shavar, so anything it touched beforehand, right, came in contact with, is not going to be impure because it didn't have a kibetza shear. But tahor mikanu lahaba, but from here on in, now that it's a kibetza, it's going to be a problem. Okay, that seems very clearly proving we go by the shear it is now. But Amar Rabba, kol hecha demi kara. Okay, Rabba's going to come now and re-explain this whole machloket. Okay, we thought this machloket was across the board in all sorts of cases, right? Any case, we go by the past, we go by the future, right? Any direction. Comes Rabba and he explains it, and we're going to have some difficulties with Rabba going forward. He says the following. Kol hecha demiikar havabe v'hashta lepe halepe. If it originally was a kibetza and now it's not a kibetza, well, it doesn't have a kibetza now. There's no reason to be strict. Remember why I explained the reason to be strict is because people see the kibetza, they think it's food that's a kibetza, and they think, it's going to be matame. He says, no. If it didn't have a kibetza, if it had a kibetza originally, and now it's not a kibetza, so nobody thinks there's any reason to say it passes on impurity. It's shrunk. It's not anymore the size, volume of what you need it to be. So it's not. It doesn't do anything. And like we said in the previous section, anywhere where it didn't have a shear originally, and now it does, there we're going to be strict on a rabbinic level, because what does it look like? It looks like it has a kibetza, and it was impure. So we assume that it could pass on impurity. We'd rather just say by rabbinic law, let's say it passes on impurity, even though it doesn't really, because it really goes by the original. Okay? But, so basically what he's saying is, they don't really have such a debate. In either of those cases, they all agree. Those three rabbis, they all agree in the basic cases. Okay? If it had and doesn't have, so it doesn't have now. It's not going to be impure. We're not going to pass on impurity. If it didn't have and it has, well, by Torah law, it didn't have, so it's fine. And by rabbinic law, we're going to be strict. Turning now to Amud Bet, ki pligi. So what is the machloket according to Rabbi? In a very unique case. And he really limits the case to the following. Kigon shahayabo kishiul, vitzamak, v'chazar v'tafach. It's going to be a case where it originally was a kibetza, it shrunk, and then it expanded again. Demar saval yesh dichoy b'isura, umar shavar ein dichoy b'isura. The whole debate between them is, remember dichoy and korbanot, like if at a certain point in time the korban becomes irrelevant to being a korban, right, disqualified, but then becomes qualified again. Do we say, we say it's rejected completely. So this concept of rejection, does it apply in the world of tuma and tara, which here they call isur? It's like isur v'heter, but it's really tuma and tara. Does it apply in isurim or in tuma and tara, basically? Meaning, if it was rejected from being able, what happened? It was a kibetza originally, it could pass on impurity. Then it shrunk and was no longer able to pass on impurity. At that moment, do we say, that's it, forever. It can't pass on impurity. Even if it now expands back to what it was originally, it doesn't matter. It was already rejected from being able to pass on impurity. That would be yesh dichoy b'isura, and that would be those who say, we go by what it is now. Now, it's not really what it is now, because in the end it changes back, but since what it was now in the middle stage was it can no longer pass on impurity, it stays that way. Umar savar ein dichoy b'isura. The other one says, no, there is no such thing as dichoy in the world of Yisurim. Well, it's true that at a time it couldn't pass on impurity. When it goes back to being the size it originally was, it goes back to being the size it originally was, and then we go back to those who say we go by the original size, and its current size is the original size, basically, but it's the original size. So he redefines the whole machloket, okay? Even though that's not what we thought the machloket was originally, that's how he redefines it. Now, the main point being, okay, before we get to this difficulty on this, which we're actually not going to resolve, he's going to have a difficulty on one of the sides, but what's going to be important for moving on is what he basically says, that everyone agrees that if it had a shear originally and then shrunk, okay, and now it doesn't have a shear, we view this as if it doesn't have a shear. We don't care what it was originally. He basically thinks that everyone thinks that, and for that we're going to bring a slew of difficulties. One today and at least one tomorrow. I think just one tomorrow. Okay? So that's what's going to be important for moving forward. But now they're going to have a question on is there really someone who holds that there's dichoy in isurim? Really? Isn't that right? It seems like it's just an issue for sacrifices, not for isurim. And how do we know? We're now going to bring a Mishnah in Taharot, which basically says they're going to bring exactly this case, and they're going to show that there isn't dichoy, that it's going to go back and create impurity. We're going to see right now. Kibetza ochalin shenicham bechama v'nitmatu. So we had a shear of a kibetza, an egg bulk of food, that we left in the sun, and it shrunk. V'chein kazayit min amet. Okay, now we're going to have a whole list, not just kibetza of ochel, but other impure items, like a kazayit from a dead body, or there the shear is an olive bulk, or an olive bulk of kazayit min nevela from a dead animal, which also passes on impurity, or chadasham min asheretz, a creepy crawler, exactly the size of a lentil, much smaller, that it carries on impurity. And forget about the world of impurity. We're now talking about really surim, kizaya pigul, kizaya notar, kizaya chelev. If you eat a kizaya pigul, you're going to get karet. A kizaya notar, a kizaya chelev. Now, if it's shrunk, though, before you ate it, and it's less than an olive bulk, so all these things shrunk to less than whatever their requisite amount was, teholim, and the ones that were world of tum and tara, so they don't pass on impurity, and ein chayavim alehem mishum pigul notar v'tamei. You're not going to be obligated for any of those things, because you didn't eat a kazayit in the end. Hinicham bagshamim v'tafchu. This is the important part. Okay, first of all, that matches Rabbi, who basically said we always go by, if it's shrunk, we go by what it is now. It's not a problem. But if afterwards you put them back outside and the rain came down and tapchu and they expanded back to what they were originally, it all reverts back. So that seems to go against the one who says yesh dichoy b'isurim, and once it loses its status forever. Okay, to which they say, yeah, tiyuvta l'man damar yesh dichoy b'isurim tiyuvta. The whole group of rabbis who we now said, according to Rabbi, claim that yesh dichoy b'isurim, this source seems to really go against that. Okay, and they don't have an answer. They leave it as a question. Now we're going to have a difficulty on Rabbi, and this is going to take us to the end of today's daf, this difficulty. Tashma, tormim te'inim ala golgorot b'minyan. Okay, we're now going into a tosefta in Terumot. Now, teruma, let's just talk about teruma, maaser. Let's go through what all these things are. If you have a pile of, let's say, 100 items, you have to take first teruma, gedola, which is you're going to give a portion to the Kohen. There we're going to do it by assessment, like you can just take, and it's about, the ideal is the middle is 150. The ideal is to do 1 in 60 or 1 in 40. Okay, you can do, the ideal is to do 1 in 40. You could do 1 in 60. There's ayin ra'ah, ayin tovah. There's better ways to do it more generously, but the average is 1 in 50. Now, that's teruma. After you finish your teruma gedola, so let's say you do the average. You take 1 in 50. So now you take 2 out of that pile of 100. You're left with 98. Now you have to take maaser. You have to give to the Levi a tenth. So you give the maaser, so you give 9.8 of what you have to the Levi. Now you're left the Levi, okay, and we're going to stop after this one. There's more, but I want to get into what we need to know today. The Levi gets 9.8 fruits, let's say, whatever it is, okay, now he has to take 1/10 of that and give it to the Kohen. He has to take his own teruma. It's called teruma maaser, but it's different than our 1/50th that we give. He has to give 1/10 of his what he gets from everyone else to the Kohen. That's called teruma maaser. Okay, so now it's unclear which one we're talking about here. It says tormim, but tormim is a general rule for teruma maaser, teruma maybe maaser. We don't really know right now. Okay, but let's just read it. Right now, the Gemara thinks they're talking about maaser, and you'll see why as we go on. Okay, it becomes very clear we're going to quote the Breita in the Tosefta in sections. When we get to the third section, they're going to use numbers of 10 and 90. And because of that, it's going to be pretty clear, which means basically 10 out of 100. And there's 10 of these and 90 of those, which means they're going to take 10 out of 100. And you're going to assume that they're talking about maaser. And that's why the Gemara starts assuming this is maaser. So now we have figs that are fresh and figs that are dry. Now, if you measure by volume, then you're going to have, the dried figs you're going to need a lot more to fill up that volume, right? If they were fresh. And if you go by number, then it's, okay, so there's going to be a question, do we go by number, do we go by volume? So, tormim te'inim ala golgorot b'minyan. If you're doing, now, the issue is like this. When I do teruma maaserot, I take, let's say, lemons on lemons and oranges on oranges, but I can't take lemons for oranges. So, can I take figs for dried figs, fresh figs for dried figs? So, when I do that, apparently I can, because figs and figs, it's fine, even though they're in different forms. But if I take fresh ones for dry ones, that's what it means, te'inim al golgorot. So, let's say we're talking about maaser, and we're talking about 10 out of 100. So, I could take 10 fresh figs. If I have 10 fresh figs and 90 dried ones, I could take the 10 fresh ones, and that resolves the issue for the 90 dried ones. Now, if we say we go by what they were original in size, then that makes perfect sense, shapir, because originally there were 100 fresh figs. So I'm basically taking 10 on 100 fresh figs. We basically view them as if they were fresh. But if we go by what they are now, Havale merabe b'maschot. Utznan marbe b'maschot pirutav metukanin u'masrotav mekulkalin. Okay, let's just explain this Mishnah for a minute, and then we'll go back and explain the problem. If I take too much maaser, it's a problem. Okay, why? If I take, let's say I have 10 items, and instead of taking 1 on 9, I take 2 on 8, okay? So I've resolved the problem for the 8, because on those 8, I've taken until I take any maaser, right, or all the stuff. I can't eat my food. It's called tevel. But once I take 1 on the 8, okay, that resolves it, basically, okay? The 1 to the 8, or let's maybe give an example where I took 2 to 11. So if I take 2 to 11, I'm left with 9 that are maaser, basically, because I took 1 for those 9, so that's 1 in 10. That's good. But the 2 that I took, one of them is good, because that was the maaser. The other one doesn't really count as maaser. So the other one is actually, that's what it says, masrotav mekulkalin. The 1, and we don't know which one, so basically we're going to say the 2, are basically untithed produce. Because it's not really maaser, because it's not 1 in 10, and maaser is an exact thing, basically, is what we're going to say. And it's not tithe because I did 2 to the 9. I didn't do 1 to the 11 or whatever. It wouldn't work then anyway, but 1 to the 10. So basically that one is a problem, and that one is now mixed with the other one, and we don't know which was the one that worked and which didn't. So even though the 9 are perfectly good, the 2 are messed up. Okay, the masrotav mekulkalot. So I can't do that. So now they say like this. If we say that it goes by the measurement it is now, and I take 10 fresh ones on 90 dried ones, I now have a problem because I took way too much. Because let's assume, okay, let's just say to make things easier, when the figs dry, they're about half the size they were before. So now when I took, let's say 1 on 9, okay, 1 to 9, I really took, it's like taking 1 to 18. The opposite. 2, it's like taking, how do I say it? Right, it's like taking 2 to 9, because this one fig that's fresh is worth 2 of the other ones. So it's like taking 2 to 9, which is the case I described before, which is a problem. So therefore, it must be likemot. The way, right, it's basically going to say it must be like the original, because that's why you could take by number, you can take the fresh ones on the dried ones. Okay, it only really fits if you say it goes by the original size. Now that goes against Rabbi, because what did Rabbi say? If they shrink, we go by what they are now. And here, we don't. Well, the Gemara says, wait a minute. Elamai. Now we're going to get super confused, because the Gemara is going to say, but according to what you're saying, we just said, lekemot, we have to go by the original size. But the next line in that Tosefta, I told you we're going to slowly unravel all the lines of the Tosefta, seems to say the opposite. You can't say that it goes by the original size, because listen to the next case. It's the flip case. What if I take dried figs on fresh ones? Gorgorot al teinim bimida. If I'm taking dried figs, I'm giving them as teruma or maaser. On the fresh figs, I do it bimida. I don't do it biminyan. I do it bimida. Now, yamar bishlam hakemot shapir. Now, why do I do it b'midah? Because you have to measure what it is right now. Measure them in volume. What's the volume of the dried figs? How does that match up to the volume of the fresh ones? And that's how you have to take it. But if you say if you say we go by what they were originally, well, you can't do by volume, because originally they were all the same, and you should do it b'minyan. You should do 10 to 90 or 1 to 9, right? And if you do kemot shehen, marbe b'masrotu, if you start doing volume, you're going to end up with double the size of the amount of figs that you really need double the amount of dried ones to the amount of fresh ones, because to get to the volume of the fresh ones, you're going to need 2 times the amount. You're going to, again, have riboy masrot. So that doesn't work either. So now we're completely confused, because the first one only works according to one way, and the other one, right, only if you say original, and the second one only works if you say by now. So now we're really confused. So now they say, okay, elahacha betruma gedola askinam v'reisha ba'ayin yafa b'sefer ba'ayin yafahi. Say, this wasn't talking about maaser. In maaser, we have the problem that you can't do more than 1/10. It has to be exactly 1/10. You do 2 out of 10, you mess up. But this is talking about Truma Gedola. Truma Gedola, you can always go, right? Now, both these methods, just want you to see, are what we call Ayin Yafa. You're siding on giving the Kohen more. Because if you do, again, let's just go through the cases. You do fresh ones to dried ones, right? You're basically giving more than you really need because you really could do half the amount. But you're giving more because you're giving more of the Kohen, okay? You're going generously. If you do figs, dried figs, to fresh figs, by volume, you're adding a lot more dried figs, okay? So you're going by Ayin Yafa. Once we leave the world of Maaser and say it's Truma Gedola, well, then we're in a whole different realm because the rules for Truma Gedola and Maaser are very different. Truma Gedola is by estimate, by Ayin Yafa. You can give generously, you can always give more. Very different from Maaser, where it has to be an exact science. So the Gemara says, okay, that sounds good. And that would make sense, because until now, the Tosefta really didn't make a lot of sense. But that doesn't fit with the next line of the Tosefta. And here's the third and final part we're going to learn in this Tosefta, which is Ema Seifa. After that, what does it say? Ihachi, if you say that, it can't possibly be Truma Gedola. Why? Amar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi. Okay, so his response to this whole thing, he says, I want you to know, Abba, I'm going to tell you about my father, Hayanotel Eser Grogarocha B'maktsua, Al Tish'im Shebekilkala. He would take 10 dried figs that were in the miktsua. That's the maktsua, I think it is. That's the place where they would dry the figs. So he would take 10 from the area where they were drying it on 90 that were in the basket. Okay, no. Is he talking truma? No, because he's talking about ratio of 1/10. 1/10 is clearly maaser, not truma. So, Iba Truma Gedola, if this Tosefta was talking about Truma Gedola, like we just claimed, to resolve all the problems, Eser Ma'avidate, why are we talking about 10? 10 has nothing to do with anything. Ella, so now we have a final answer. Elahacha Betruma Maaser Askin. And that's why I set it all up for you in the beginning, what all these things are. We find the in-between, which is Truma Maaser. We're talking about a 1/10, but it has to do with Truma and not Maaser. Now, why does it help us to put it into the world of Truma? Because if it's 1/10, why is it not? Now, Truma Maaser is sort of in between. It's somewhat like Maaser, it's somewhat like Truma, right? Because it's 1/10 like the Maaser. But we're going to learn now that Abba Elazar ben Gomel, who this Tosefta follows the opinion of Abba Elazar ben Gomel, who said, I'll just tell you this in words before we read it inside, he's going to basically say, the way you take Truma Maaser, even though it's 1/10, which would make it more similar to Maaser, but it actually is done in the method of Truma Gedola. Okay, it has the characteristics of Truma Gedola, which in the end we're going to say means you could give generously. There's no problem of riboin masrot. And then we're going to explain the whole Tosefta in a way that this has nothing to do with, do we go by before, do we go by current? It just has to do with, if you're doing dried figs to fresh or fresh to dry, either which direction, we're going to always err on the side of being generous to the side of the Kohen. We're going to always give the Kohen the benefit and not ourselves. And that's why one way is going to be by number and the other way is going to be by volume. And that's basically what he's going to prove. How do we know that when you take the Truma Maaser, even though it's a 10th like the Maaser and not a 50th, right? But it has all the characteristics of Truma Gedola. And that's going to be a drasha from a pasuk. So this is Abba Elazar ben Gomel who says this. V'nechshav lachem trumatchem. This pasuk that says trumatchem, your trumot in plural. What plural trumot are there? It's trying to the Kohanim. Bishtei trumot hakatuv medaber. Echad truma gedola, echad truma maaser. They're basically making a juxtaposition, because they're both in the same word, between the both types of trumot. One is the truma that the Yisraelim give, and the other is the Levites who get their maaser. They have to give truma to the Kohen, and even though, again, the measurement is different, completely different, 1 in 50th to 1 in 10, but the method is the same. Kashem shetruma gedola nitelet ba'omed ubemachshava. Truma gedola is given by estimate. You don't measure it exactly. And b'machshava, meaning if I have a pile and I want to eat some and I haven't done it yet, I can do it in my head and say 1/50 of this in that corner is for the Kohen. And then you can eat from the other side. You don't even have to physically separate it at that point to allow you to eat the rest. Kach trumat maaser nitelet ba'omed ubemachshava. And ma truma gedola ba'ayin yafa, which is what we're looking for. You're supposed to give generously, and it's not going to ruin it if you give too much. Af trumat maaser ba'ayin yafa. Okay, and trumat maaser also is ba'ayin yafa. So with that, we resolve all the difficulties, although I will warn you that the next word is umina. Well, actually, from that last line, we're going to have a difficulty on what we just talked about our before or after, right, or current. We're going to have a problem from that. But right now, we've resolved the difficulty because we said it's talking about Teruma Maser, which resolved all our problems. It's not Riboy Masro. This is all just, we'd rather you give generously. But it doesn't really have anything to do with do we measure things by their original status if they've changed form, because this is, the fresh figs change their form, they're no dried figs. The measurement is completely different, but we see that really didn't have to do with it. They just always say, give generously. Okay, so what did we do today? We started with the mei tapuchim. Can you use that for the mincha? And can we maybe distinguish between that and a different case, right, where it relates to laws of truma? There's a lot of comparison today about how it relates, right? We had dichoy by korbanot versus dichoy in a different area, in isurim, right? Are the same concepts always the same everywhere? The chimutz that you need here is not the same as the chimutz you need for truma to say it's never batel in a food. Okay, so then we went to how you prepared the mincha chote, with water, without water, and what the debate was based on. We thought it had to do with this whole thing of the measuring. In the end, we said, no, it just has to do with how you define dry. Is it dry without oil, or dry means dry without anything, even any other liquid also. Then we started with this sugya, and we saw these two girsaot of this Mishnah in Uktzin, two different versions of, do we go by originally what it was, or what it is now, which we thought that was a big debate across the board. We brought a difficulty on one of the sources, said, oh no, that's only by rabbinic law. And then Rabbi came with this new definition of saying, they actually don't really argue in the basic case. Everyone agrees that if it's bigger, midrabanan, we're going to be machmir on the bigger. If it's now smaller, it's not a problem at all. Okay, we don't care what it was originally. The only issue is this issue of dichoy, if it changed from one stage to the other. And then we brought a difficulty on Rabbi. What do you mean? When it shrinks, we never look at it what it was originally? What about the shrinking, right? The dates that got smaller, why do we seem to view them as what they were originally? And then we had the whole back and forth till we figured out what exactly was going on here. And the real issue there was the Riboy Masra, which we basically neutralized by saying this isn't Maaser, it's Teruma Maaser, which has the definitions of Teruma and not of Maaser. And even though it was 1/10, it's not the same 1/10, and it's the Teruma Maaser and not actually Maaser. With that, we finish for today. As I said, the sugya will continue into tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom and B'sorot Tovot. Let it be a quiet Shabbat for everybody.